So the session that we were going to have now will explore the current state of practice and identify key outcomes to enable broader adoption and really try to focus on the user. Because a lot of time it's always tools and services around CWE, but we can't lose sight of the customer, the end user, and how they may or some of the challenges they may have with understanding CWE. So before we get into that session, Joe Jarzombek, who will be part of this session, as well as Greene from Veracode. Joe, as everyone knows, was very instrumental in community engagement when he had his work at DHS. I worked with Joe when I was at DHS. Joe has since then went on, and he's now is with Synopsys. And Joe's going to kick this session off with something that he thinks is important, that is a good segue from what Bob talked about in terms of the reflections to really tying in the customer perception of CWE.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. I want to kind of step back a little bit because Bob and I actually met many years ago, probably 2005. He was speaking at a conference, the Software Technology Conference, and then we started talking about this whole idea of what eventually became CWE. At the time, I was running the software assurance program for the Department of Homeland Security, and I had just taken over CVE, literally at the point when CVE had become unfunded. And I said, well, I'll take over that. So, well, how are you going to do that? Well, we managed to keep that going, but we fundamentally understood that there were some root cause issues associated with CVEs that weren't being addressed by the common vulnerabilities and exposures. And that was how it was borne out. And that's where, if we want to step back as the community that provides tools and services that are using it, why don't we look at the real user and customer perspectives to help drive adoption by focusing on why people should even care about addressing weaknesses. We know that they're addressing CVEs more, but why should they really address common weaknesses? Obviously, the exploit potential, we want to help them to understand the relationship between weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And part of that, we as a community need to be a bit better in helping our customers understand what the differences are and why. I'll talk about that. And it's certainly more than just patching vulnerabilities. We want to be able to leverage CWE to enable automation, scalability, and cybersecurity information sharing. I'll get more into these here. But if we're really going to drive adoption, we need to better link business and mission risk with the weaknesses in our cyber assets. And I'm going to end this discussion on talking about compliance with regulatory statutes, standards, and policies, and help people understand how software assurance can help reduce risk. Let's go back to a Venn diagram that I developed when I was in the Department of Homeland Security. Bob and I had been working on this. We use this to help convey this to people about the weaknesses and vulnerabilities. In fact, there's some people who will still use the generic term of vulnerabilities and they mean everything. Well, actually, it's the opposite. Everything falls under the weaknesses area. Vulnerabilities are a subset of that. In the context of, it is the existence of an exploit designed to take advantage of a weakness or multiple weaknesses to achieve a negative technical impact is what makes a weakness a vulnerability. And so people seem to care more about vulnerabilities. And so we focus a lot on CVEs. And of course, there's that little thing in the middle, the zero-day vulnerabilities. And I contend that really zero-day vulnerabilities are just CWEs that are already there that somebody else was more committed to finding than you were. And they basically exploit them with little or no warning, and that's why it becomes a zero-day vulnerability, and all of a sudden we have a new CVE. But our message should be, if you understood that these weaknesses are in your assets, that you could have scanned for these are 100% discoverable from the context of, over 2/3 of them are at the code level. So scanning is the way of doing it. So obviously design and architecture are the other flaws that we need to care about, not as easily discoverable. But again, we as a community should help our customers understand the differences, yet relationships between weaknesses and vulnerabilities, because quite frankly, different tools find different things. And I'll use examples here where we get in trouble with that. For instance, we're very familiar with the CWE top 25, obviously based on CWEs. But we know a lot of customers are asking about the OWASP top 10. Well, 9 of those are CWEs. And we know that the 10th one, or actually A9, is about using components with known vulnerabilities, which means that's 100% based on CVEs. If you're only using a tool that scans for CWEs, you're not going to find the vulnerabilities. And so that's one of the things that helping customers understand what tools you use are important. The OWASP application security verification standard is the one I'd recommend people also help their customers understand the value. Again, it's based 100% on CWEs. The object management group, through the Consortium for Information and Software Quality, has advanced the automated source code quality measures. Again, 100% based on CWEs. And the newest one that we have, and I'm going to end this by talking about the data protection one, they're all based on CWEs. And what these are, they represent a way that somebody else has basically come up with a list and said, these are important. So now customers are asking for these lists and say, tell me about those. And so our tools using that. I will tell you that we as a community perhaps are underutilizing the scoring systems, both CWSS as well as the Common Weakness Risk Analysis Framework. I could do a whole different talk on that, why I think it's important that we should still advocate the use of those, but not going to do that. As an older slide, Bob had pulled out some old ones. We recognize the fact that a lot of people care about security, they implement that, but they haven't understood the attack patterns or the weaknesses. We need to help convey why exploitable weaknesses, both in software and hardware, are the attack vectors for future zero-day vulnerabilities, or CVEs. There is guidance out there. There's both public law as well as guidance on using CWEs. Go back all the way to the National Defense Authorization Act, 2013, that actually defined software assurance as the confidence that software functions as intended and is free of vulnerabilities, either intentionally or unintentionally designed or inserted as part of software throughout the lifecycle. If you look at free of vulnerabilities, the Program Protection Plan guidance that comes out of DoD actually points to both CWEs and CVEs. So there's guidance for that. But there's other standards that organizations have to comply with. And Underwriters Labs, the 2900 series for cybersecurity assurance program for network connectable devices, references both CVEs and CWEs. These are actually codified in the ITUT standards that the Cybersecurity Information Exchange 1500 series that actually codify these, so it's recognized by the United Nations, so therefore 109 nations would recognize the ITUT standards, so we've codified it that way. But also the US Government Security Content Automation Protocol. SAE G32 is now evolving new standards on cyber physical system security, and you will see this all over in that document that talks about weaknesses and vulnerabilities at cyber physical system security, looking at that. And certainly other SAE standards address that. We also have ISO standards. The object management group has been very good on this, as well as leveraging the use of CWEs. And the one I want to really address is the automated source code quality measures that I think we as a community ought to help advance that, because it focuses on the use of CWEs, but related to security, reliability, performance efficiency, maintainability, and the newest one on data protection that just came out the end of last year, that's now being standardized. And it's really looking at source code, specifically impacting data leakage or data corruption, basically using the CWEs that enable unauthorized access to read or modify data. And that's why if we turn back to what is in law, what are the current standards and guidance that organizations have to comply with today, there is actually a role of CWE that we're very much not using as much as we could. Because right now, many organizations are going through process assessments associated with data protection and privacy. DoD's coming out with a cybersecurity maturity model certification, and that's all based on the NIST 800-171. But there's also privacy standards, GDPR over in Europe, California with CCPA, and now the CPRA, healthcare with HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act has been out there for financial services. All of these are looking at how do you protect data and privacy. And so we can stand back and say, we can actually help audit organizations. A use case for the relevance of this is scanning code that will run or is running on an enterprise network connected assets that process or transmit data would determine if systems or devices enable data leakage and therefore lack the adequate protections to mitigate unauthorized access to read or modify data. If we can discover that, this is kind of like ground truth. It says, how is it you could possibly comply with the law if your systems are fundamentally leaking data? And so,
Hey, Joe,
we need to help our customers understand that. So just stand back and ask that question. Are we helping them understand their business risk? So
yeah, I want to jump back in, right? So I thank you so much for providing some really good content for us. And I want to try to pull Chris Ingen from Veracode and really get his perspective on whether or not, why should customers care? And do you think they really understand, or why, I should say, why is it important for them to understand a weakness versus a vulnerability?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Thanks, Joe, for the history there. I know you've been involved with this for a long time, and as you were talking, I was going back through my hard drive, and the first version of CWE that I downloaded was 0.4, which was at some point in 2006, as we were preparing at Veracode to start our mapping process, and take a chance on this taxonomy that was really not even established there as a baseline or as a requirement yet, right? So interesting to see how far it's come. And you're right, there's still so much, not as much confusion as there used to be, but I would say at least once a week, a customer will ask if our static analysis will scan for CVE 2021 dash whatever. So the misunderstanding is still definitely there, and part of that stemmed from the idea that that there was this terminology, right, weakness, that people were not really using at the time. We were kind of in parallel trying to figure out, well, what do we call these things that static analysis finds, and we ended up using flaw. Flaw has picked up quite a bit as well, but even going back to that point, if we had alignment across different vendors on like what do we call this thing, and let's all use the same term, we probably would have been in better shape. There would still be plenty of confusion. But as far as customers go, early on there was not a whole lot of opinion on, they weren't requiring, they didn't want you to use CWE, or they weren't requiring that you use a particular taxonomy. They just wanted you to have some level of organization. And today, I feel like CWE is table stakes. If you're releasing any sort of tool that does not use CWE, it puts you at a stark difference from every other vendor out there, right? Every other tool. So that's a great thing for this program, is that it really has become the standard. What customers tend to care about, and I've got a few of these. I don't know how to put this other than customers often tend to care less about correctness and more about stability. And by that I mean that changes, especially unexpected changes, are extremely disruptive. So, for example, when a CWE changes or something becomes deprecated, that has a surprisingly large blast radius, because if you think about how people are managing their larger programs, they are tracking the flaws that they find over time. And if suddenly you have 100 flaws disappear from one CWE and appear in a different one, that looks weird on all your metrics, right? And we've experienced this a number of times. And every vendor here has, especially that's been using it for a while, right? You write a scan to detect something. There's not a perfect CWE for it, so you use one that's a little bit more broad than you would hope for, and now you're kind of locked into that. Down the road, a more specific one will be developed. Maybe you submitted it and it gets approved, but a better one comes out, and so then you have to make the switch, and that requires so much planning and lead time to customers. This is what customers really gets to them. And the other one is taxonomies. Joe started to get at this a little bit. If there's no MITRE defined view for a taxonomy, like the OWASP top 10 or one of the CERT lists or CWE top 25, obviously, then it's going to cause the vendors to diverge even more than they would otherwise. Not to say that when there's a view there, it's perfect. There's still a lot of room for interpretation. But when there's not one, that creates a lot of disruption. So customers expect CWE to understand and keep track of the taxonomies and the lists that are relevant to them, whether it's from a compliance perspective or whether it's from their own customers asking them, hey, do you scan against the OWASP top 10? And they want to be able to say, yes, we do. And vendor X and vendor Y, which we use, both test for those taxonomies and can tell us, how we're doing against those. Those are like the biggest things that, in 15 years of doing this with customers, that they have tend to care about the most. So I'll shut up there and kind of let this kind of evolve a little bit.
Let me follow up on that with both of you guys. So how can MITRE and MITRE in collaboration with industry, how can we help customers, how can we better position customers in this regard in terms of their understanding or helping them improve their understanding and knowledge around CWE or the difference between CWE and the vulnerability, or some of the issues that you talked about, Chris, in terms of the blast radius that may be associated with a change in how the initial intent of the CWE was understood and how it was mapped to a particular rule or whatever the case. How can we better be positioned to help customers in this regard?
I think that there has to be a commitment to like we have to know which lists, which industry standards are we going to commit to staying on top of? I think that's a big one. We start to get questions about, hey, when are you guys going to support, the OWASP API top 10 or the OWASP mobile top 10? And, and then the answer is from a tool vendor perspective is like, well, we do. It's just that we have to map the things that we find into those taxonomies. And when we do that, if we invent that on our own, which largely we've had to do, then every other vendor out there is going to do it a different way. And so it's much better if MITRE is able to say, like, well, when a new version of the OWASP top 10 comes out, we're going to have a view for that within one release or whatever, right? So that we can all kind of get behind that, and regardless of which combinations of tools a customer is using, they're gonna have a similar interpretation of that. Right now, we don't know, and customers don't know which things MITRE is going to pay attention to, and there's a lot of room for disagreement there, right? The OWASP API top 10 is not a standard, really. It's somebody's project, right? Whereas the OWASP top 10 and some of these other ones that are more mature that have made it into regulatory standards are more defined as standards. So there's kind of a gray area here, but I do think we have to draw a line and say, what are we going to provide stronger guidance on? I don't know, what else have you heard, Joe?
So I'm going to step back even further on that, because I will tell you that a lot of customers fear the auditor more than they fear the attacker. And what do I mean by that? That says they've got to comply with different laws, regulatory regimes. Often it's driven by their customers that says you've got to look at that. And so when we can look at how does with scanning software, how does it help a customer understand, is that vendor in helping me be in compliance? Are they putting me more at risk of being out of compliance because of the software that they've got? And so doing that linkage between CWEs and controls that are in these various process standards, 853, ISO 27001, now with the data protection ones. So part of that, so we've done some of the mapping there as well. You guys have done mappings. I think that we could all get behind this a little bit more. We actually codified that and made it publicly available through the Consortium for Information Software Quality, saying, here's our mapping of these CWEs against these different ones. So that's a way of helping people understand that. But fundamentally, a lot of these organizations don't care about this until their customers care about it. And so by us helping to explain to the world how CWE can help them do that, you know, why did anybody even ask for the CWE top 25? Why did anybody ask for the OWASP top 10? It's because their customers cared about it. And so now you started doing it. So we've got to help inform the customer's customer to start driving that. That's why people care.
So I want to open it up to folks on the call as well. We want this to be interactive. While we have the panelists part of the sessions to kind of jumpstart the conversation, we really want to really engage the community as well. So are there any questions regarding to the customer perspective or some of the things we discussed regarding weaknesses versus vulnerability that you think is important to chime in and clarify based on your perspective? Because obviously, each vendor works with a different set of customers. They have a different viewpoint. So we want to get a broader viewpoint of some of the issues that may be hindering the customer perception around CWE.
And Kevin, I see that Amy has had her hand raised for a while. So why don't we start with her?
Sure, Amy.
Hi, I'm very interested in what Chris said about the OWASP view and the role of that. Can I just clarify, are you saying that you see a role for that as actually a normative definition of the OWASP rules, of the OWASP guidelines?
Well, what I was trying to say with that is that anything that's becoming a standard that customers are looking to vendors to say, like, this set of results is free of the standard, or the findings can be organized under the standard in this way. I think that CWE needs to provide that. Now we have that for the OWASP top 10, and we have for going back to, I think, the 2004 list or the 2007 list. There still is room for interpretation. For example, and with all the views, right? Oftentimes what will happen is, and this gets into the mapping discussion that I think you may be even part of later, but for example, you want to include cross-site scripting on the list because that's on the OWASP top 10, it's in the CWE. So you put CWE 79 on the list. Well, meanwhile, CWE 80, 82, 83, 85, right? These are all cross-site scripting, and they're not explicitly, some of these may not explicitly be part of the view. So as a vendor, you now have to essentially traverse the hierarchy and say, well, start with this view as defined by MITRE, walk down the children and figure out what you also need to include, so that when you have a series of findings and your customer asks you, what do I have in here that is relevant to the OWASP top 10, that I give them a list of the right things. And that's where the interpretations tend to slide a little bit. But if we don't have that initial view, we don't even have that starting point, then that's even tougher, right? Then my tool and your tool and everybody else's tool are going to be even more off. So having a starting point as a view, I think, gets us part of the way there.
But
that's what I was trying to say.
It's important to help customers understand which of these are relevant to them. I mean, we've seen people ask for the OWASP top 10, but they were scanning an IoT embedded device. I said, right, connected to the web. This is not relevant. But they don't know that. So we have to do a good job of helping convey that.
So what are some possible ways to kind of convey that? I think we keep saying, we have to do a better job, but I want MITRE to be on the hook as well, as being playing a tremendous role in working with industry to solve these issues. If users are not aware of or can distinguish the different types of taxonomies that may be mapped to specific standards, like, well, I don't necessarily want to call them a standard, but but that's mapped to other types of things to express an importance of specific issues in the context of a particular sector or domain. how can we better work? We need to identify some really, really tangible ways to do that. Can someone talk about, you know, what you had in mind in terms of some of those things that we can do, work together collaboratively to do?
Yeah, Kevin, can I jump in on that one?
Sure, sure.
So I think Chris hit it on the nose when he talked about how doing mappings is a challenge. I don't know if the ultimate solution is MITRE owning that, but what I think would be beneficial is going through the exercise of attempting to do some of these mappings directly at the CWE layer will highlight some of the other challenges the industry is facing trying to use CWE. I think Chris used the example of cross-site scripting. Well, if you also ask questions like, is command injection an input validation problem?
Maybe.
Maybe. And is it included as a child of CWE 20? No, it's not. Right. So these mapping challenges where you're trying to map to a standard such as PCI, or whether it's an industry best practice such as OWASP Top 10, or if it's a methodology such as OWASP ASVS, these are challenges that are faced across the industry, and you're not going to get consistent views until you look at the underlying challenges.
I think Janana had her hand raised, and I want to
Yeah,
make sure I
got
get to her as well.
James
Yeah.
and Alex as well.
Okay.
Thanks, Kevin, but I raised several times, so now
Sorry
I
about
don't
that.
know where do I fit anymore.
Sorry.
Doesn't matter, I'll just speak. So one of the things that it's, I think it's real, on one side it's issue, on the other side is a plus. But issue is that CWEs are standardized labels, and they are not standardized the compliance points. And we cannot have them as standardized compliance points because they are not formally expressed, right? They need to be formalized and needs to be real ontology and taxonomy behind. I know Chris is referring to them as a taxonomy, but it's really not. It's just a standardized labels. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. By the way, Joe, there is another OMG standard that is referring to CWEs. That's the software fault patterns metamodel. So
Yes.
You might want to include that one in your charts.
Yeah.
But being a part of all this community and this CWE team since ever, you know, the way how we started, how Bob Martin started and Steve Christie and all that, it was really heroic move. You know, at that time we needed to do something because there was nothing done prior to that, and we experienced a lot of issues, right, in cybersecurity. So one of the issues there was as well that team who actually started, and as I said, the heroic team, and they done a wonderful job in one way, but team was a CVE team, and so they knew how to put together CVEs. However, CWEs is totally different beast. And so we have CVEs way of working, a way of communicating, evolving into the CWEs. So we have a lots of inheritance from there. CWEs are really patterns, while CVEs are instances. So they could be enumerated.
Right.
The CWE is supposed to be patterns, right? And supposed to be compliance points, patterns that are formally expressed. And until we have that, I mean, we can use the standardized labels and CWEs should be used. And because it is, for me, de facto standard in a sense that it's widely used, and we should utilize that. But underneath of CWEs, we need to put that support, formalized support. And we tried, there was the DoD program, which was a software fault patterns, and we tried to move toward that direction, and we showed how this can be done. And I think this should be carried on. Different teams, same community, but everybody should be everybody should contribute into that. but CWEs are on top of it. I think we should, as Joe pointed out, it references so many even standards, so many government regulations. They're referencing CWEs, and we should utilize that and stick with that. But put that underneath support, that it's formally representing and supporting CWEs in that term. In those
Thanks, Janata. Thanks, Janata. I think we got two more hands raised. We have James and Eric. I'm gonna go in that order, James, then Eric. We just a reminder, we have about 15 minutes left for the session. So we want to, if others have comments, we want to get those in. To you, James, go ahead.
Thanks, Kevin. So one of the biggest challenges our customers have today is what I would call vulnerability or weakness overload. And I think it always existed, but now that they have they have static analysis, they have dynamic analysis, they have interactive, they have SCA, they have some newfangled stuff. It's very present. And so what our customers are asking for, and we're building, is an approach where the OWASP top 10 is interesting, and that's sort of generic. But what our customers want is they understand that all their applications are different and they have different needs and they should focus on different things. So they want something that's actually very similar to CWSS and CWRAF. I never pronounced that one very well, CRAF. My experience in the past with those standards was that they, to me, they feel a bit outdated for in terminology and what we're trying to do today. But I believe that there's some value in potentially revisiting those concepts, right? I think they were sort of ahead of their time, perhaps. But this is a really big pain point for our customers, and I imagine that other vendors are hearing sort of the same thing. Like, how can you help me prioritize this big list of findings that I have in a way that's most meaningful for my business?
So, what would CWE's role be in? I hear the pain point for sure. It's a lot. It's a lot to handle. I'm trying to understand what feature or capabilities CWE would bring to the prioritization aspect of it.
I think there might be some. We have industry standards around taxonomies, but there are also standards around process and framework. And at this point, we're building our own. We have our own sort of methodology in mind about how you should establish risk and so on. But I think there might be value in having some discussion. So when an industry gets together and sort of shares their thoughts, and I think we get a clearer map of what the problem is, and maybe just some frameworks around how to approach risk assessment and these policies, which might be worthwhile. And something to think about and potentially explore.
Yeah, Chris, I think one of the ways, if you look back to what we did with the Common Weakness Risk Analysis Framework, it was to create vignettes. And so think of this in combination with CWSS. You basically have come out with a top N list, say top 40 list, that's relevant to a given sector, say it's healthcare and medical devices, saying if you're deploying this type of medical device, here's your top list of weaknesses that you should look for. Because from my experience, most customers don't say, don't make me use the scoring system. Just tell me what I should be specifying. So these vignettes help you identify that list that you should care about for a given technology deployed in a particular environment. So we could help build out the Common Weakness Risk Analysis Framework with those vignettes.
Hey, Eric, I want to go ahead and get to you, Eric, because I know your hand was raised and Alex is after Eric. So after Alex, we're probably going to wrap up the session, but I want to make sure I get to Eric and then Alex in that order.
Sure, thanks. So right now, CWE is essentially a self-attestation. Like as a vendor, we're able to provide and say, these are the CWEs that we support, but their children and parents. So one of the things that would help me, and I know probably increase compatibility with other vendors, is if we could have like an automated suite where we could run an analyzer against the suite and it could pick out which CWEs you found based on things somewhat similar to the OWASP benchmark or the Juliet suite, because what this could help us do as vendors is pick out which parent-child CWEs we found, so that we could have some consistency in terms of who looked for things and who found things. Similarly, as we built out our own test suites for different frameworks, libraries, or whatnot, where we would look for those CWEs, it would create a point of contribution where people could actually work on this test. The Java community has something similar for OpenJDK, where if you want to be a compatible distribution, you have to pass something called the Test Compatibility Kit, which demonstrates that you are the same. So if we had a CWE compatibility kit, it would make it easier to declare CWE compatibility.
And it would have to be based on languages.
Yeah, you'd have to create it like on a per language or kind of per area you would look.
I have thoughts on benchmarks, and we probably don't have enough time for that. But just going through the years, there have been so many that have attempted to solve this problem. There was Summate, there was the SATE, which may still be active. There was Juliet, there was OWASP benchmark, and the problem with all of these is that they, without common ground prior to that around how we categorize things, you already have. I talked before about flux, right? Like if we're categorizing something a certain way, if we change the way we do that as a vendor, that creates extreme pain for customers. So if a benchmark comes along and says, well, you have to categorize this in this way, and you have to flag it on this line, right? Some of us flag on the source, some of us flag on the sink, some of us flag somewhere else. Some of us will not use categories. Some of us will not use variants and only use bases. There's just so much variation there that the benchmarks create a real problem. On top of that, you have benchmarks that that have so many unrealistic synthetic cases that would never appear in real life code that you start to ask, well, what is the value in detecting some of these things? There will never be code that looks like this. I remember some of the test suites had code that didn't even compile.
Oh yeah.
And right, and so there have been challenges with this and at a certain point, at Veracode, we were like, we're not doing this SATE thing anymore. Like this is taking up so much time and so much effort, and no customer is even asking for it. Like no, right? The findings from some of these studies were very valuable in the sense that they said, like, well, look, the most overlap we had across two products was X%. So we've learned that that's a difficult thing for tools to do. And I don't know if that's where we're going to get. What I think is more important to customers is that you have a way of this. I think this goes back to what you were saying before, Joe, is that you have a way of either mapping into what regulatory or compliance things are important to them, or telling them what's important, what risks they have, right? What they should care about. And we get a lot less of how do you do against this test suite. And I'll stop there because I could go on about this one for like all day.
And I think we're going to get to some of that later in some of the topics. But before we wrap up this session, since Alexander had his hand up, I want to make sure I get to one last point that he's going to make. Go ahead, Alexander.
So yeah, just one other point on this, Kevin. Earlier in the discussion, CBSS was brought up. And one of the challenges that is present, and I've always seen this as a challenge that is solvable, is why do we not have say a static analysis or a runtime analysis or a dynamic analysis tool that's assigned to CWE? Why would we not have a base score for the weakness type that is actually consumed by a larger CBSS score? And then there's upvote, downvote in the heuristic based on other evidence on top of just the type of weakness. But as an example, if you knew that something led to a command injection attack, that should have a base score. And if all the vendors could consume an algorithm that predicted the risk to an organization you need to patch, partly based on the weakness type itself, that could essentially make getting scores from tools much easier.
Yeah, context matters in that regard, and I think maybe that's something that we kind of make a note of, and definitely want to explore with not only the CWE board but the larger software assurance community. I think this session has been very helpful. I think you all provided good insights, and I thank you so much. I think at the end of the day, you know, we do want customers understanding what CWE is, right? Because I do think that is very helpful in making sure it's more broadly adopted within industry. And I think it has, you know, downstream impacts in terms of how we develop software, how we monitor our systems, compliance. It has so many touch points to other things that we do operationally in environments. So I do think having customers or working with industry, MITRE working with industry to come up with creative ways to do more awareness and education around CWE is very important, because I do think also it will allow the compatibility program to soar a lot higher. If we can clear up some of the differences and make sure that we provide the right guidance in terms of how to do X, Y, and Z. I think, you know, we're going to hear more of that in the mapping conversation later, but I do think these are initial good starting points at this